Hello everyone. The first thing I'd like to do is say thank you to the organisers of 21st Century Guitar for inviting me to come and talk to you today, but also for putting on this absolutely incredible week that we started earlier today and that we have ahead of us for the next few days. There are some absolutely incredible sessions, some really fascinating looking papers and a huge array of new music performances. So a big thank you to Amy and to Rita and to all the committee for making this wonderful thing happen. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a new piece of mine called Hiraeth, but also about Manuel de Falla, Andrés Segovia, and the politics of nostalgia. I'm going to be talking about my solo guitar piece, Hiraeth, which was commissioned last year to mark the centenary of Manuel de Falla's Homenaje. So my piece Hiraeth connects directly with Homenaje, and I'll be talking in detail about how the two pieces relate. So I'll start my talk this afternoon by telling you a little bit about my piece. Then I'll move on to talking about the topics of nostalgia, melancholy, and Hiraeth in general. Then I'll focus on Falla's Homenaje and how it relates to tradition, style, and performance practice, and how Falla engaged with the idiom that is the guitar. After discussing Falla's approach to the guitar, what I'd like to do is compare that with the different kinds of approaches that were taken by Segovia and other collaborators. I'll also focus a little bit on the piece Saraband by Poulenc. At the end there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions after a complete performance of the piece Hiraeth by the Australian guitarist Ken Murray. So Hiraeth was commissioned for Ken Murray by the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music, University of Melbourne, to mark the centenary of Manuel de Falla's Homenaje à Debussy for guitar. The premiere of Hiraeth took place online on March the 8th, 2021, marking the exact 100th anniversary of the first official performance of Homenaje given by Miguel Lobet at the Teatro de la Comedia, Madrid, on March the 8th, 1921. The title, Hiraeth, is a Welsh word, which means sort of nostalgia, or more commonly homesickness. Many Welsh people, myself included, claim that Hiraeth is a word which cannot be translated, meaning more than solely missing something or missing home. To some, it deploys the meaning of missing a time, an era, or a person. It is associated with the bittersweet memory of missing something or someone, while being grateful of that or their existence. So nostalgia and melancholy provide the atmosphere for Hiraeth. I imagine Manuel de Falla yearning for an ideal Granada while spending his final years in self-imposed exile in Argentina. This is depicted by a recurring sighing figure in the music, a slow glissando from F to E. Hiraeth also incorporates some harp-like material that alludes to the Robert ap Hugh manuscript, a 14th century collection of Welsh bardic harp music. Music by Falla and Debussy is quoted and referenced in my piece, alongside references to the Welsh bardic harp music. Some features of Falla's Homenaje are amplified, put under the microscope for closer consideration. The semitone F to E psi figure becomes a trope that underpins Hiraeth. This is an important motif in Falla's Homenaje too, as we'll see later. The sixth string is tuned to F for most of Hiraeth, finally resolving to E in a retuning gesture that is an important focal point of my piece. The semitone F to E figure also suggested the quotations from El Amor Brujo, presenting the figure in a contrasting harmonic context. Lobet transcribed this piece for guitar in a version approved by Falla, so it seemed apt to include it here. Homenaje itself quotes from Debussy's La Soirée d'Engrenade in its closing section. In Hiraeth, I reference the opening of Debussy's piece, blending it with material from Falla's Homenaje in a tonally ambiguous phantasmagoria. This prepares the ear for the complete performance of Homenaje, which concludes Hiraeth. Now I'll play an example from the retuning gesture through the final section of Hiraeth into the link into Falla's Homenaje. So let's get back to the ideas of nostalgia, melancholy, and Hiraeth. If nostalgia is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations, melancholy is kind of the foil to that, a feeling of pensive sadness, typically with no obvious case. And it strikes me that Hiraeth is really a combination of these two in kind of equal measure. But I'm not sure it's such an untranslatable word, and I'm not sure that it's something which is specific to the Welsh and only the Welsh. It would appear that many languages have a similar untranslatable word to Hiraeth. Here are some examples from Portuguese, Japanese, Russian, Brazilian Portuguese, Galician, Romanian, German, and Ethiopian. There are others too. A lot of these words tie in a combination of nostalgia and melancholy. The recent writings of Eco, Boym, Hatherley, Riley, and Bauman point to an epidemic of nostalgia in many aspects of today's culture and society. A yearning for a return to a comfortable Arcadian retrotopia. Give me my country back, make America great again. In his book, Retrotopia, Zygmunt Bauman argues that today the utopian aspiration is projected towards the return to an ideal past more than towards the construction of a better future, in response to a Hobbesian world of growing insecurity and violence. In her book, The Future of Nostalgia, Svetlana Boym talks about a global epidemic of nostalgia, an effective yearning for a community with a collective memory, a longing for continuity in a fragmented world. She says that nostalgia is a sentiment of loss and displacement, but it's also a romance with one's own fantasy. She goes on to say that it works as a defense mechanism at a time of accelerated rhythms of life and historical upheavals. And she points out that it relinquishes critical thinking for emotional bonding. But perhaps most significantly, Boym gives us a binary model of two very different kinds of nostalgia. First of all, a reflective, personal nostalgia, one that is internal. And secondly, a restorative, societal nostalgia, one that's external. And she describes it as representing national and nationalist revivals all over the world, which engage in the anti-modern myth-making of history by means of a return to national symbols and myths. Now, this model of two different kinds of nostalgia can be mapped onto the difference between neoclassicism and neo-romanticism in 20th century Spanish music. I would argue that Falla's neoclassicism is music that critically engages with elements of music of the past, but maintaining a modernist aesthetic. Whereas neo-romanticism, a style much favoured by the Franco regime, is music that romanticizes music of the past through a restorative aesthetic. I will go on to argue that these neoclassical and neo-romantic approaches can be applied to interpretation as well as being applicable to composition. I'm going to come back to talking about neoclassicism and neo-romanticism in a moment, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about Falla's Homenaje. There are several factors which contribute to the significant place the Homenaje holds in the guitar repertoire. It's the first piece written for the guitar by a non-guitarist composer who really engaged with the idiom. Falla uses the instrument and its cultural heritage to generate his musical material. The Phrygian relationship between F and E, the harmonic underpinning from the two lowest open strings, E and A. Falla had been fascinated by the guitar for many years before writing Homenaje, and could probably play it to some extent. Michael Christoforidis points out that just before composing Homenaje, Falla had completed work on his most extensive piano work, Fantasia Baetica, a work that draws extensively on his study of flamenco and flamenco guitar music. There are very distinct echoes of flamenco and its guitar manifestations in the Homenaje as well, ranging from harmonic progressions and chord spacings to specific guitar techniques and figurations, and even aspects of the way in which the work is structured. So Homenaje was written at the height of Falla's international acclaim, 1920, a time when he was often compared to Stravinsky and Bartók. But Homenaje's longer-term significance is, to a large extent, accidental. It's a tiny piece, yet an atlas bearing the entire weight of the modern repertoire on its shoulders. Later repertoire by non-guitarists didn't interrogate the guitar's unique idiom in such a forensic way. As a slight aside at this point, it was last year at the 21st Century Guitar Conference in Ottawa, in Canada, that I was first introduced to the work of Jonathan de Souza and his work on idiom and the way in which the musical brain develops in relation to the tools that a musician is using, and those tools could be the instruments or the voice and so on. So what I would say to Falla's approach to writing Homenaje is that he focused on this body-instrument interaction, treating the guitar as a creative prosthesis at the intersection of technique and technology. Segovia's collaborations with composers, by contrast, were more concerned with translating abstract compositional ideas so that they might be effective for the guitar after some intermediary work. And of course, this intermediary work was done by Segovia himself. Consequently, the composers who wrote for Segovia wrote at one remove from the idiom. Casanova Tedesco wrote dozens of guitar works throughout his entire life, but he always required guitarists to mediate the music he wrote so it would fit the instrument. Falla's Homenaje focuses on what the guitar does best, working with its history and folkloric roots rather than against them, celebrating its idiosyncratic open strings rather than apologizing for them. In 1971, Andrés Segovia outlined what he considered to be the 4 essential tasks of his life's work. I want to focus on the first 2. Number 1, to separate the guitar from the mindless folklore type of entertainment. And number 2, to endow it with a repertoire of high quality, made up of works possessing intrinsic musical value from the pens of composers accustomed to writing for orchestra, piano, violin, etc. Now, from Segovia's point of view, what he was trying to do was he was trying to bring the guitar, and by 1971 it was known as the classical guitar, into the mainstream classical repertoire. The world was a very different place in those days, and the hierarchy between high art culture and classical music and popular music was very different from the much more kind of integrated and pluralistic world we have today. So Segovia felt that in order to get people to treat the guitar seriously, it had to be removed from its folkloric roots, the very roots that Manuel de Falla is trying to rediscover in his Homenaje. The next important subtext to what Segovia writes here is the idea that works of high quality come from composers who are not guitarists. And in fact, it seems that there's an idealistic approach here to what music is, as if it's something abstract, and that musical ideas are something that come from the pens of great composers. And they're not things that are found when people are noodling on the guitar. And Segovia's role in all his collaborations was to translate these musical ideas from the composer's mind, or more usually the composer's piano drafts, into something that will work on the guitar. So an indicative list of the Segovia composers: Turina, Rodrigo, Casanova Tedesco, Tansman, Ponce. All these composers were neoclassical conservative composers. Their music was written in a tonal language and romantic in style. And Segovia's collaborative process was usually interventionist, almost as if Segovia was a composer manqué. Segovia's collaborations are well documented, mainly in the letters. Firstly, in the published letters between Ponce and Segovia, or rather the letters from Segovia to Ponce, and also in the recently discovered and edited letters between Casanova Tedesco and Segovia. These form the recent doctoral thesis of Benjamin Braun. And in them you get a very clear idea of how Segovia worked with composers' material. As long ago as 1986, in Graham Wade's book on Segovia, he quotes Segovia as saying, "I always have to modify many things, but we do this so as not to betray the music, and so that we do not omit what the music has to offer, but in order to make the music better for the instrument. I am accustomed, you know, with the composers who have written for me, to modify something or other in almost every bar." Now, the striking thing about this, it's almost as if Segovia's approach to arranging keyboard music, lute music and so on for the guitar is similar to his way of arranging composers' ideas for the guitar. So the composers are composing music and Segovia is turning it into guitar music. Segovia was not a fan of modernism, and elsewhere he said, "I'm too old to accept this terribly dissonant music. The composers are experimenting with noise. When the noise will be sound and the sound will be music, I will have an opinion." Abstract painting and musique concrète both are denials of true art. By commissioning so much neo-romantic and arguably anachronistic music, was Andrés Segovia more interested in making a past for the guitar rather than a future? Did he fabricate a tradition, a chimera of transcriptions and pastiche compositions to emulate the thoroughbred classical traditions of other instruments, particularly voice, piano, violin and cello? A restorative nostalgia for an Arcadian retrotopia. There is no doubt that the music that Segovia commissioned is very important to our modern guitar repertoire. There are many works of exceptionally high quality. But very few, if any, composers of Falla's standing and reputation wrote for the guitar in the first half of the 20th century. And Falla wrote just this one 3-minute miniature. Its rarity, its quality, its clarity, and its concision all contribute to its significance. The downside of this importance is a misplaced profundity that has led many performers to play the piece far slower than the metronome mark suggests, and with a rubato that undermines the rhythmic integrity of the habanera and the distinct characters of the varied musical gestures. I asked Falla expert Michael Christoforidis how we account for the many varied interpretations of the piece. He told me, "I think that the most obvious reason for the variety of tempos associated with the guitar interpretations is that it was published in the early guitar editions with the subtitle Le Tombeau de Debussy, which denoted the collection of pieces it was drawn from, and not the title given by the composer, which was simply Homenaje or Homenaje à Debussy. This has made some guitarists feel that it is something akin to a funereal dirge rather than a nostalgic habanera, and given them license to take the piece at a much slower tempo than the one indicated by the composer, which is quarter note equals 60. Also, I think that many of the early guitarists who performed the piece were much more attuned to a romantic or even impressionistic sensibility and style of performance that does not fully align with Falla's more modern conception of the work. These performers also tended to seek more coloristic effects rather than the austerity of tone and use of open strings that typified flamenco performers and had formed part of the conception of Falla's work. We're all familiar with the concept of historically informed performance practice. But I want to introduce the idea of historically mediated performance tradition. Now this is a different kind of thing altogether. This is an idea that a performer will start playing a particular work in a particular way that leads to a performance tradition based on that initial interpretation, however far removed from the initial conception of the piece that interpretation is. Let's listen to Narcissa Yepeth playing Falla's Homenaje. I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that that performance bears no relation whatsoever to the aesthetic of Falla's piece. It goes against everything that Falla's piece stands for. But it represents a particular way of playing the piece, and one that is copied and extended and developed by many, a neo-romantic performance practice for a neoclassical work. Now, this is not uncommon in the guitar world, and the whole notion of historically mediated performance tradition enters just about everything written for the guitar throughout the 20th and 21st century, including all the Boym repertoire and a whole host of other pieces. Many years ago, I had a conversation with Christopher Rowland, who played in the Fitzwilliam String Quartet, and they recorded all Shostakovich's quartets in the early 1970s. And the quartet said to Shostakovich, you know, we're playing this music in a very kind of austere style, no glissandi, none of the kind of romantic trappings of the early recordings of your works. Should we try and emulate those early recordings? And Shostakovich said, absolutely not. You know, I detested that style of playing, but it was how people played and I couldn't do anything about it. Now, finally, I'm hearing my music as it should be played. What's strange about this approach to Falla's Homenaje is that a performer like Hiraeth decides to finger the piece in a way that goes against Falla's original idea. Falla engaged directly with the idiom, with open string chords, deliberately mimicking flamenco guitar. Another piece which presents an interesting problem is Poulenc's Sarabande. It's a very simple piece, but the addition has very complicated fingering. Instead of remaining in first position, the fingering takes the guitarist all over the fretboard, including harmonics and various other effects. It's unclear as to who has done this fingering. The piece is dedicated to Ida Presti, and there's also an addition by Ablonis, but we don't know who did the fingering. But Sabrina Vlaskalic, when she was doing her research, looked into the piece and said this: I decided to abandon all the ideas of the editor and develop my own fingering. I decided to play the piece in the simplest way possible, by playing all the notes in the first position on the guitar in order to develop the consistently cleanest sound timbre on the guitar I could conceive. A reason for choosing the cleanest possible timbre lies in the fact that Poulenc employed many open strings of the instrument. He used them often throughout the piece, employing all 6 open strings at the very end of the piece, and therefore one might even suppose that he might have actually composed this piece on the guitar. When played in first position only, this piece can easily be played by a beginner or a guitar amateur. The level one would or even could imagine Poulenc might have had if he had played it on guitar. So here we have a situation where composers are trying desperately to engage with the idiom, but guitarists are pushing them away. This whole sense of the mediation between the two. I'd now like to return to my piece, Hiraeth. I am a composer, but I'm also a guitarist. And the piece Hiraeth is very much conceived through the idiom of the guitar. I couldn't possibly imagine it being transcribed for any other instrument. And the guitar itself is an important ingredient in the compositional process. Pushing the idiom, playing around with the idiom, is something, as a composer, I love to do. Historically, composers have almost been kept at arm's length from the idiom of the guitar, either by a guitarist taking responsibility and making the piece work, or by a guitarist taking a piece which is trying to be idiomatic and playing it in a way that contradicts the composer's approach. Throughout the 20th century, the guitar certainly suffered an inferiority complex. Segovia, for one, wanted the guitar to be taken as a serious classical instrument. To hide all its shortcomings, all its idiomatic idiosyncrasies, all its folkloric roots. He wanted the guitar to be a wolf in sheep's clothing. In the 21st century, things have changed. Now composers are celebrating the idiom of the guitar and its idiosyncratic links with folkloric music and popular music. There are many more composers who happen to play guitar who are writing highly idiomatic music for the instrument. And then there's the opportunity for 21st century composers who want to write for guitar but don't play the instrument to follow the model of Manuel de Falla, which involved direct engagement with the idiom itself. Thank you all very much for listening. You'll now hear a complete performance of my piece Hiraeth, which is immediately followed by Falla's Homenaje, played in a neoclassical modernist style by Ken Murray. Thank you all very much, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and have some discussion after the film of the performance. Thanks.